For those who don't know Peter, he's a film critic and journalist, film judge, film festival consultant based in Melbourne. He's a former chair of the Australian Film Critics Association. He hosts two Movie Metropolis film radio programs every week, and he contributes film reviews to various radio outlets, newspapers, and magazines. He's served on various festival juries here and overseas, and he's a professional member of the Australian Academy of Cinema and Television Arts and a member of the Australian Film Pioneers. So, Peter, over to you to take us through the jazz singer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray, and welcome everyone to this event. Such a special film, The Jazz Singer, for so many reasons. And hopefully everyone's had a chance to look at The Jazz Singer on Wikipedia. It is in many ways an incredible film and one that needs a fair bit of discussion as well because of its significance and of its representation. So what I'll do now is I will share my screen and we will begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on such a significant film. And hopefully everyone's been able to see the film, The Jazz Singer from 1927, the first official sound feature film. And it is such a significant film for many respects, including, of course, its game-changing approach to cinema, because it did introduce talking cinema, the talkies, to cinema across the world. And because of that, it is a really significant film. So let's start talking about it, and let's begin. Yes, there are a number of aspects of The Jazz Singer, talking about the silent era and also about the way cinema changed significantly around that time, 1927, and the subsequent impact that the film had. And wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. And that was such a significant line that emanated from the screen by Jolson singing to his mother. And it certainly provided the major introduction to sound on screen. So these are the things that I'll be covering during the presentation, looking at silent cinema and how it had developed, the early attempts at sound films, Warner Brothers and creating the Jazz Singer. They took quite a risk in making this film or producing this film, the role of sound on disc, etc., and the film itself. And how that turned into the talkies, the impact of sound cinema in the 20s and 30s, and remakes of The Jazz Singer, contemporary reactions, and other responses. So, silent cinema was quite significant in the 1920s. It is quite clear that the fluidity and imagery of silent cinema had developed to the extent that the films that you see there on the screen are really significant and major films. I mean, everything from Charlie Chaplin, of course, to Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments in 1923 was quite an epic experience in terms of its imagery. Buster Keaton used silent cinema brilliantly in his films, such as The General and Sherlock Jr. Sunrise, Murnau's film, is an absolutely superb, beautifully crafted visual and oral treat, not an oral treat, I should say, a visual treat. But it created that idea that here is this couple wrapped up in this romantic situation and fraught with difficulties. Wings, of course, the first film to win an Oscar, was another visual treat. The Crowd, King Vidor's film, the Chaplin, of course, with the circus, and the Gold Rush, and Victor Sjöström's film, The Wind, which was also such a significant silent film. So all of these are silent films and brilliantly realized, and it would be great to, if you haven't seen some of them, to catch up with them. And internationally, there were other visually important films that used imagery and fluidity of camera work so well. I mean, of course, Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin is a wonderful film, especially with its editing. Such a great craft that was used for that film. Nosferatu, the Murnau film, and Caligari. The Germans really had that Gothic visual style really well wrapped up. And there were others, of course. Early Hitchcock, The Lodger, was visually quite arresting. And he experimented quite early with mobile camera work. Metropolis, of course, one of the greatest films, in my opinion, of all time. Fritz Lang's film is visually so important. Napoleon, Abel Gance's film is incredible, actually. It's a major cinematic tour de force, really. And so on. Man with a Movie Camera, Dziga Vertov. So there's some really fantastic films that were developed in the silent era, which, as soon as sound came about, put a bit of a stop to that wonderful visual mobile imagery, temporarily, of course. So early attempts at sound attached to silent film date all the way back, in fact, to the 1890s. Edison experimented with using phonogram sound married to moving images. Others had also tried to put together or marry sound with film. And in fact, there are a couple of examples on the next slide that you can look at on YouTube, which in 1908, for example, tried to put sound on disc or phonogram sound onto film, or marry it with film, so synchronize it. So Edison also developed the kinetophone cylinder, sound on disc, in 1913, which was an advance on the phonogram sound. Lee De Forest is a major player in this field, developing or trying to develop optical sound on film rather than disc. Photokinema sound on disc was developed in 1925, but in 1925, Western Electric developed the Vitagraph Vitaphone system, sound on disc, which really enhanced the quality of sound on those large discs. And this became the adopted process by film studios and the industry for early talking movies. Many short films were made using the Vitagraph Vitaphone process. And in fact, the first real sound feature film, which had synchronized audio effects and a bit of music, was Don Juan in 1926, directed by Alan Crosland. And that used in some parts of the film some sound effects, etc., to try and show that in a feature film, you can marry up sound and image, which of course then moved on. So these are the two links on YouTube that you can check out at your leisure, which looked at very early sound and film and trying to put the two together. So it has been around for quite a while, this experimentation with sound and film, but it was really Don Juan, the feature film, that put sound into that feature film. And then, of course, we move on to the jazz singer. The Warner Brothers, Polish Jewish immigrants to the USA. There were so many Jewish immigrants to the USA, escaping Europe, leaving Europe for many reasons. And they headed up a studio, Warner Brothers, and Harry Warner in particular began Warner Brothers Pictures in 1923. They were keen storytellers. They wanted to break into the film market, seeing that that was a way that cinema was progressing so well and could be a way of making money. So they were responsible for making a number of films in the mid-20s, but the films that they had made at that time were not doing that well, and they needed to find a niche or a way of finding a film that would give them a real boost, and put some profit into their studios, so that they could compete with some of the other major players like Paramount and Universal and so many others. So finding the right story to draw attention to Warner Brothers films, they attended, or Samson Raphaelson attended a play featuring Al Jolson as a Jolson, who's another Jewish immigrant, and Lithuanian-born Jew Al Jolson, who often performed in blackface, which was a typical social convention of the era where Jews performed in different cultural characteristics in order to be accepted by the diaspora, by the disparate New York community. And at the time, it was not seen as a racial slight or anything like that. It was just seen as being accepted and adopting a characteristic that would be more easily accepted by the New York community. Now, Raphaelson wrote a short story, The Day of Atonement, which of course is Yom Kippur, about a young Jew based on Jolson's life, which was then adapted into a stage play. So it was partly also Raphaelson's lived experience, and of course the stage play became The Jazz Singer. It was staged eventually as a straight drama in 1925, and starred George Jessel, who was also a popular performer at the time, not Jewish. The Warner Brothers acquired the movie rights in 1926, with Jessel, who was attached as the lead for the film. But due to financial difficulties, Harry Warner, who invested a lot of his own money in the studio, decided the film was going to be a sound film, or going to use sound, after having some previous success with some short films that used sound on disc. Jessel objected to the change in the storyline, to having sound in the film, and he also wanted more money. Actors wanting more money, how could they? But Warner Brothers said no, they couldn't afford it. They refused it. They also the Warner Brothers approached Eddie Cantor to star in the film, another popular stage performer at the time, who is Jewish, was Jewish, but he refused to be part of the film, which led to Al Jolson being offered the role of the jazz singer. So the screenplay, as developed by Rafelson, Cohn, and Yarmouth, reflected the original stage play with some modifications to allow for some sound sequences. And the film was again directed by Alan Crosland, who directed, of course, Don Juan, which was that 1926 film, which had some sound effects added to the film. The film also reflected the Warner Brothers Jewish heritage and the Jewish diaspora in New York. And of course, Jewish and Yiddish identity was a strong part of American immigration, as was the use of blackface, as I've mentioned, as a dominant American societal and cultural entertainment expectation. People loved seeing white performers in blackface because it gave them some sort of sense of culture and integration and assimilation. The story, of course, was about a Jewish boy wanting to find his own path, which was fairly typical of Jewish experience, but certainly of immigrant experience, rather than being a cantor, a singer in his father's synagogue, much, of course, to the father's chagrin. The adaptation for the film had the jazz singer, who became a stage performer, return to the Winter Garden to perform in blackface. This was an added component, which was not in the stage production, and it was added so that it could demonstrate to the delight of his mother that he had found his niche, his performance, his identity, away from the family expectation, and mother clearly accepted that. This, of course, reinforced the cultural stereotype of a Jewish man breaking free from religious and cultural expectations, but also the view that entertainment was the savior in his freedom. And there is a sound file that you can check out on Wikipedia, which had that wonderful sound that came from the Jazz Singer film. You ain't heard nothing yet. So now, in terms of the sound of the film, there's 2 minutes, would you believe, of part scripted, part ad-lib dialogue by Jolson. That's all, even though it's an 89-minute film, but there were 11 songs integrated, the sound of 11 songs integrated into the film. So there's a total of 15 minutes of actual sound in the film. And of course, with the issue that all the sound had to be recorded on discs, the discs could only hold a capacity of 5 minutes at any one time, and that there were 15 reels of film. The synchronization of those discs and the film by the projectionist, who must have been very emotional, trying to make sure it was all done correctly, because one error or one incorrect cue or synchronization, and the whole thing would have looked ridiculous on screen. And as we know, when we see something that's asynchronous on screen and it doesn't quite fit, then we immediately think something gone wrong. Anyway, so that was massive. Now, the film cost around $500,000 to produce, which in today's money isn't much, but at that time was a massive outlay for the Warner Brothers. Their films had not made huge amounts of money. They were desperately looking for something that would give them financial backing to make sure their studios would continue and were sound. And so they took a big risk by moving to this experimental sort of situation of going to this commercial sound film. So $500,000 at the time is around $6 million today, which really is an incredible sum for what really amounts to a small film in many respects. So they gambled on this. They thought that this would work. and that it would be a draw card, it would be distinctive, it would be different, and that audiences would definitely want to attend something, A, because of Al Jolson, such a popular performer, B, because sound. What is sound? Sound on film. That's a sound film, because the sound is on disc, of course. A sound movie would have been quite revolutionary for so many people who are so used to the wonderful silent cinema that have been going for so long. And they thought, no, it was worth the risk to give it a shot. So now the other issue, of course, that cinemas had to be equipped with amplification capacity and adequate sound speakers. So this new technology just couldn't be launched overnight. It had to be properly equipped. And so the Warner's Theatre in New York in 1927 was very much equipped to be able to achieve playing the jazz singer with its full sound capacity. The film premiered on the 6th of October, interestingly enough, on the eve of Yom Kippur, which of course is the high holy day for Jewish community. But again, the Warner Brothers thought that it was very appropriate that it premiered at that time, because they also wanted a strong New York Jewish community to attend the film because of the story. All right, so at that first screening, there was an incredible response from the audience. In fact, many were shouting "Jolson, Jolson, Jolson" at the end of the film. They appreciated Asa Jolson, Al Jolson, and his 15 minutes of singing and some dialogue. And they appreciated that this was an historic film, that there was something different about this film because of the use of sound. The first reviews of the film were interesting. The Life magazine reviewer, Robert E. Sherwood, already could see that sound film was going to be important. As he said, fraught with tremendous significance. And he already predicted that the end of silent cinema was in sight. However, not all reviews were positive. And the New York Times critic thought that, well, Don Juan had some special sound effects, and it was okay. So this was not a bad sort of experimental device, but the dialogue wasn't very effective, he said, and voice wasn't so clear, and so he thought that maybe it would not necessarily survive. Sound film would not necessarily survive that much longer. It was fun, but wasn't fantastic. It was interesting. There were some other negative responses that I looked at, like Luella Parsons, who was a famous publicist at the time, said, gee, the jazz singer, it was a screeching sound coming from the speakers, and sound will never happen. It's not going to happen at all. And Irving Thalberg, who was later became an important MGM executive in the 30s and produced a number of films, said, oh, it's a good gimmick, but that's all. Boy, was he off the mark. But far and above, most responses and reactions were favorable, praising Jolson, the use of sound, that this was a significant turning point in cinema, and that this film was going to revolutionize the industry in many respects. Even though, as you've already heard from my earlier slides, sound had been used to some extent, but not to the extent that the jazz singer really made it a commercial success. So the film was successful. financially. It wasn't a massive hit, partly because, of course, not all cinemas were converted, and so rolling out the film to cinemas across the US and then later to Europe was not easy because of the conversion rate, which was very slow for cinemas to get sound speakers and so on going, and to have that calibration. But nevertheless, especially in New York and especially in the US and the bigger cities, the film did very well indeed. And of course, the Warner Brothers were so thrilled with Jolson and with the success of the film that they made a follow-up film with him, The Singing Fool, which was completely sound on disc, was even more successful and made even more money for them. So they were on a winner. And so after that, from the late 20s onwards, silent cinema was gradually scaled back. The writing was on the wall that sound cinema, the talkies, were now here to stay, and that cinema now had to reinvent itself and to get used to this. Of course, Chaplin, as we know, was a bit of a holdout in his films of the late 20s, early 30s. He kept his films silent, although he would later synchronize some music or some sound effects. But basically, he kept dialogue out of his films as long as possible. And in Europe, of course, the rollout was a bit slower as well. So eventually, though, it did roll out in Europe, and we had some early sound films in France and Germany that were able to use sound. But of course, what really took off once the sound on disc phenomenon was established was the importance of sound on film. And the whole notion that you didn't have to have discs anymore. You could put the sound on the film itself. You didn't need all sorts of issues related to traveling films around. You just had the reel of films that without the discs that had to go with it. It was less expensive to record. It was more expensive to record sound on film at first, but they got over that very quickly because the system was much better in terms of cinemas being able to show films with sound on film. And it's interesting, in Australia in 1929, I read that there was a sound on film portable system that was developed, that was toured in country towns across many rural cities in Australia in the late 20s to show films sound on film. They didn't have to worry about the sound on disc. Now, at the Academy Awards, which was very interesting, the first awards that were presented in 1929, the film was not allowed to be placed in the Best Film nomination category because it was regarded at the time as unfair competition to silent cinema. And I thought that was really amusing to read AMPAS, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and the arguments that they had about whether the jazz singer should even be thought about at all at the Academy Awards. Eventually, some cooler heads prevailed, and they decided that it would receive a nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay. Yes, all 2 minutes of the screenplay, and the songs. It didn't win in that category, but there were a number of people in the Academy that said, this is a revolutionary film and we must award this film with something to show that it is such an important film and that was going to change the industry. So it received an honorary Oscar for the Warner Brothers for producing The Jazz Singer to pioneer outstanding, as pioneers of an outstanding talking picture, which has revolutionized the industry. It is just so interesting to consider that in the first Academy Awards, such a significant film could have been totally excluded. But politics always plays a part in everything, especially in the film world, as we know. So anyway, let's move on. So now the first all-talking feature, because The Singing Fool was sort of, again, a mixture of some dialogue and, but in particular, lots and lots of songs. But the first all-talking feature in 1928 was released, sound on disc, still, The Lights of New York. And that obviously heralded an era where people now had an appetite to see completely sound films, talking films. So in fact, by 1929, all the major film studios were producing sound films, although the sound on disc process very quickly did disappear because of its difficulties and issues, and the sound on film capacity was developed very rapidly. Fox, Movietone, and RCA Photophone combined, and so that became the standard for sound on film in the industry. Now, in those early sound films, actors had to speak into these massive microphones that were very carefully disguised on set, sometimes not so carefully. And those microphones were incredibly large, so they had to be placed behind these massive pot plants or behind other sorts of sets that were quite incredible, so that they couldn't be seen. And of course, you had to have a blimp or a camera house, which enclosed the camera so that no extraneous sounds could possibly be recorded apart from what came through the microphone. And so, of course, cinematography became almost non-existent because the camera had to be anchored, couldn't move, and it had to be focused on the actors and on the microphone, or where the microphone was, so that everyone could talk into it. It was those early sound films from the late 1920s are just incredibly rigid and lack so much in terms of the way cinema had been progressing. It was almost an embarrassment, some of those early sound films, because of the anchoring that was needed. However, again, the industry learned very quickly that that could not be sustained, and that especially with sound on film and with new sound technology, etc., and with smaller microphones, all sorts of things, mobile cameras, etc., they were able to very quickly change that issue. And the tedious task of synchronizing those discs and film reels, which I know in some cinemas became a major issue, because projectionists were not always properly trained up to show those films, or it was so easy to make a mistake that that had to very rapidly disappear in favor of sound on film. So having the sound on the film strip meant that the cinema industry developed what's called Academy ratio very quickly, so that it would incorporate next to the actual film itself the sound strip, but that could then be projected through projectors that were able to house both the sound and the film itself, or the image, if you like. And as 35mm film developed, etc., cinema was able to adapt, and the sound strip was adjacent to and didn't take up space within the image that would normally have been used. So it's amazing how quickly technology had to develop to incorporate sound on film, but there was an appetite for it, and so the investment that studios put into it and production companies was absolutely incredible because of the success of the Jazz Singer and subsequent early sound films. Now, the early sound films also, and of course you'll pick that up if you've had a look at the Jazz Singer and some other very early 1920s, late 1920s sound films, the sound was very clunky. It occasionally could be a little distorted, or it could be a bit screechy at times. And some actors' voices did not record as well as perhaps it should have been recorded. And so there was that issue that actors were cast in many respects from theatre, because they had clearly developed voices and they would record much better. They were able to project their voices very well. And so they sounded better when they were recorded. But other actors who were not necessarily from theatre, sometimes their voices did not record well at all. Now, there is an often quoted case of John Gilbert, who was a romantic comedy drama actor of the late 20s, early 30s in particular, but came from silent cinema, whose voice recording early on was somewhat shrill. And hearing some of those recordings, it gave rise to the idea that his career was killed because of his voice, when in fact it wasn't his voice, because in some of the films of the early 30s that he was in, his voice was much more natural, especially when the sound quality had improved considerably, and that we heard his real voice much more clearly. But there was this misconception that has permeated Hollywood for so long, that actors lost their careers because their voices were shocking and and so on, which was not necessarily the case at all. It was more about the quality of the sound recording at the time. But again, as sound mixing and sound recording technology developed considerably and quickly, certainly by the early to mid 1930s, and amplification in cinemas improved considerably as well, then that did not become an issue any further. So once the camera was freed from the blimp, and I'll come back to that when I talk about some films that address that whole issue of being filmed in the early sound period, filmmakers were able to become more fluid. Cameras were free, cameras were more mobile again in the early 30s, and there were some really strong films that were developed in the early 1930s that were able to, again, show that the camera was able to move around, was able to have excellent images as well as sound, and also to synchronize sound much better, especially with the sound on film recording system, and add looping, which in the mid-30s was still fairly early, but that's where you're able to dub voices onto a film soundtrack, not necessarily record it live. And of course, the film industry today is redolent with looping. It is so important because recording good quality sound live is not necessarily always going to happen. All right, let's move on. So if we now look at some examples of films from the late 1920s and early 1930s that started to use sound well, and also to have better camera movements and to free themselves from that blimp, etc. I mean, Hitchcock did an excellent job with being able to use sound and image so well in Blackmail in 1929, one of his earliest films. He already was able to experiment with mobile cameras and with early sound. And then we had a lot of musicals, of course, that were developed because early sound wanted to show off musicals and stage productions in particular. But some of them, like Broadway Melody of 1929, were able to have a better image and better coverage in terms of the use of camera. And then if we look at some of the other films from around the world that were made at that time, I mean, Dziga Vertov's incredible Russian film, Enthusiasm, if you haven't seen it, it is an incredible one to check out. René Clair did such a great job with experimenting with marrying image and sound and having mobile camera work as well under the roofs of Paris. And I just saw a few nights ago, À nous la liberté, which is a 1931 film, but it is so incredibly beautiful in terms of the way it's shot and the use of sound. The Blue Angel, of course, Joseph von Sternberg's film, which was actually also dubbed from its original German and shot in English as well because of its international prominence, and so on. I mean, Chaplin did add a bit of sound and music to City Lights, but it was substantially a silent film, even though he did a little bit of experimentation with adding some music and sound. And so that culminated in the early 30s with such incredible films. Probably one of the best musicals of the early 30s, The 42nd Street, which used camera. Busby Berkeley did such great dance direction in his films, was able to use camera and sound so well. And of course, King Kong, what a classic film that is in terms of its incredible special effects and imagery, as well as the use of sound. And of course, who can forget Fay Wray's Scream? That in itself is a classic. All right, now let's talk about other aspects. Yes, representation of blackface in the 20s and 30s looked at today is racist. Certainly, it is cultural appropriation. It is fraught with issues. I mean, the black and white minstrels, which were so popular in America from the 20s, 30s, even through to the 1960s, very popular indeed. So that use of blackface was so well supported by audiences. Of course, looking at that today, no, it is not good. But at the time, it was totally accepted. I mean, if we look at so many other films that have used cultural appropriation and representation so badly, I mean, a good example is Breakfast at Tiffany's. If you've seen Mickey Rooney's Asian character, it is just appalling. And yet in 1961, for the film, it was regarded as being fine, popular, okay. It was amusing. No one really had any second thoughts about it. So, I mean, different social periods will look at things differently. And of course, today, when we look at blackface, if we look at that in particular, we know that that is fraught with issues. And yet, it was used importantly to represent, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of Jewish identity integrating into accepted social identity at the time in New York, and the diaspora and the immigrants who had arrived from Europe, and that blackface was seen as being part of the American identity and life, not as being racist at that period of time. So there's a quote there about 70 examples of blackface were used in early sound film that were examined. And the Jazz Singer is unique because the blackface was used as a central part of the narrative and of the theme of the film, and of finding himself in the community. So yes, it was an important representation at that time. So and there's oh dear, and there's you're about to be invaded, and there's another quote there about which I also have just described, about how important blackface was at the time to establish identity, to establish being part of the white community that was accepting blackface. So, okay, it's something obviously to argue about, but it was accepted at that time. Of course, there are lots of opposing views, understandably and quite correctly. Was it necessary for him to adopt, for Jolson to have that blackface minstrel identity in the film? Could he have not adopted another sort of identity to proclaim his Jewishness as well as his acceptance by the community? I mean, there's a number of different arguments that could be used about that, but that whole notion of assimilation, blackface was an important part of that. And that Samson Raffleson, who wrote the original play, is that this one writer says blackface minstrel was the new Jewish cantor. So it was a new representation, a new face to a new identity for the character to be able to move on and to find acceptance in the community. And it's interesting to note that the Jewish press at the time, and I've read some of that, accepted it. And in fact, the Jewish community was also accepting and adopting African-American music from Harlem and from other identities of that period. So it was never seen as being racist by the Jewish community that the jazz singer or Al Jolson went into blackface. And that you can see Scott Iman's comment there, that the Warners wanted to show that they were part of the community, that the Jewish community was part of everyone's life and community, and that this was a way of demonstrating it. Of course, looking at it in today's prism, of course, it is a bit different, but it was an important aspect of the 1920s society at the time. So, yep, something to understand, to argue about. Absolutely, I understand. Now, the jazz singer had 2 remakes. Yes. Why? No, in 1952, Danny Thomas, who was a popular actor at the time, mainly because he's a television show, which he then went on to make in 1953. So this predates his television show. A Jewish actor at the time, was in bit parts and so on. He was cast in a remake that was based on Raffleson's play, and directed by that excellent American director, Michael Curtiz, who had made so many good thrillers and dramas, etc. But he also made a remake of The Jazz Singer, which I'm sure he still regrets to this day. Anyway, the script by Frank Davis, Leonard Stern, and Louis Meltzer adapted somewhat freely Raffleson's play. In this case, Jerry Golding plays the jazz singer. Yes, a different character name. He returns from the Korean War, so just a small adaptation from the original storyline. Very minor, I think. I don't think anyone noticed. With plans to becoming a singer rather than a cantor, so that was at least correct to the original storyline that his father had mapped out for him. His father, the cantor, was played by Edouard France, a popular dramatic actor of the day, not Jewish, but I'm glad to say underplayed his role. It wasn't massive melodramatic sort of role that he did play in this case. But of course, there had to be a love interest, didn't there? And so Peggy Lee was introduced into the film. It's so important, the jazz singer, to be accepted, also had a love interest. There was no blackface used in that film. I think cooler heads prevailed at that time, because there was so much going on anyway in America in terms of racial divide. But the film was not, I've seen it, it's not a particularly strong drama. It's a fairly basic sort of storyline about this man who wants to seek his own direction, and eventually he does. Surprise, surprise. New songs were composed for the film. None of them were particularly interesting or important, and the film has largely disappeared. I think you may be able to catch it on some platforms. It might even be on YouTube, but it's a film to see, to compare with the 1927 version, but it's also a film to respond to rather negatively, because it is a most unfortunate remake. But if we're talking about unfortunate remakes, let's look at the even more recent remake. Oh dear, yes, this is the 1980 version with Neil Diamond, who at least was Jewish, and Laurence Olivier, who played the cantor. Oy vey is my comment later down. No. Anyway, the film was written completely rewritten by Baker and Foreman, although they did stick largely to the Raffleson play, and it was directed by two directors, one of whom was fired. I'll get onto that. Richard Fleischer and Sidney J. Fury. Lucy Arnaz was cast in the film. It seems that there was no auditions. She was just cast in it. Not sure why. Caitlin Adams and Paul Nicholas. The reason for Neil Diamond being involved in the film is that he lobbied to be in the film because he wanted to showcase some new songs that he had written. And he did showcase 3 new songs which became very popular. America, Hello Again, Love on the Rocks, which were showcased in The Jazz Singer. So in a sense, this 1980 remake of The Jazz Singer was pioneering, but for all the wrong reasons, perhaps. So in this case, Neil Diamond plays Jess Robin, a young cantor who wants to succeed outside the synagogue, but he wants to be a singer. Interesting to note, there is no jazz in this film. Yes, the film is called The Jazz Singer. There's no jazz. But so he travels America to find himself, as you do, and to sing his songs and to separate himself from his controlling father, overacted, hammerly played by Laurence Olivier, who obviously did it for the money. But there was one sequence in blackface. And when I looked at this film, I thought, why the hell did they do this in 1980? And the reason given was that they wanted to pay homage to the original film. And so by having one musical number in blackface, the producers thought that this would be a way for people to remember the 1927 film. Not appropriate, I thought, but that was the thinking that was going on at the time. Laurence Olivier, you've got to see this film. It actually has turned up only a few weeks ago on Channel 9, the Neil Diamond version. And I think it might even be on 9 now, because it's one of those films that would be on free streaming, because who would want to pay to see it? But Laurence Olivier, Laurence Olivier won a Razzie, a Golden Raspberry Award, for his role in the film. Boy, was he criticised. When the reviews came out, people were, reasonably okay about Neil Diamond. They didn't think that much of the film. They thought, yeah, it was a great showcase for Diamond songs. Lucy Arnaz, she's, of course, Lucille Ball's daughter. They thought, yeah, but the writing of the film was part of the problem. And one director, Sidney J. Fury, was fired because he wasn't happy with the way the film was progressing. I think he also was objecting to the scene in blackface that was put into the film. So he was fired, and Richard Fleischer directed the rest of the film. Well, what can I say? The film was profitable, not because it was a good film, but because of Neil Diamond's songs, and it was marketed for the soundtrack, etc., and not for the quality of the film. So, but it's worth catching up with, because it's a film you must see and have a bit of a laugh at. It's very entertaining in some respects, but Lots of problems with that film. All right. So just to conclude, if we look at some films that dealt with the transition of silent cinema to sound, of course, everyone is familiar with Singing in the Rain, which actually did it very cleverly and brilliantly and most amusingly. Stanley Donen and Gene Kelly did such a good job. Yes, they did exaggerate some of it, but it doesn't matter. It was actually very well depicted, and the actress who with her terrible screeching voice in the film, I mean, yes, of course that was exaggerated a little bit, but it was all highlighting the fact that transition to sound was not easy for Hollywood at the time. Nickelodeon was a really interesting film that's been dismissed by too many people, by Peter Bogdanovich, looking at the sound era and what an incredible period that was. Silent Movie, which was marvelously sent up by Mel Brooks. And the only actor who speaks in the film Silent Movie is Marcel Marceau. How ironically beautiful is that? And what does he say? No. I thought Mel Brooks did that brilliantly. That sent up the whole sound era beautifully. Now, a film that's not so well known, but has a massive cast of Hollywood actors, Won Ton Ton. Into that you can read Rin Tin Tin, the dog who saved Hollywood. Looked at the way the dog Rin Tin Tin saved Hollywood because it featured in many late silent films and then transitioned into sound, and was directed by Michael Winner. If you can catch up with that film, it certainly is worth seeing. Chaplin, of course, dealing with the whole notion of Charlie Chaplin, Richard Attenborough's film, did it quite well, looking at his silent cinema, and then it sort of addresses his attitude toward sound in those early in that early period in the late 20s. Michel Hazanavicius's wonderful film The Artist, which was shot as a silent film in 2011 and in fact won the Oscar for Best Film, is a great homage to silent cinema before it transitioned to sound, and it is certainly worth seeing. And then the much underrated frenetic film by Damien Chazelle, Babylon, which had a great sequence in it, which had the camera in the blimp, and about 20 retakes of the same scene, trying to get the sound right, because they never got the sound right. And eventually, no, I won't spoil it if you haven't seen Babylon, what happens with the cinematographer in the blimp. It is an incredible film, and of course it's homage to cinema generally, and from the transition to silent to sound, I think does it brilliantly. So, and also on YouTube, there are 4 excellent YouTube films that you can catch up with. I wasn't able to link them, but you'll be able to find them quite easily from the titles, which looked at the transition from silent to sound. So, such an important film, The Jazz Singer, for so many reasons. And I think it sort of turned Hollywood on its head, and certainly turned cinema on its head because of its significance in terms of being the first official sound film, a major sound release. And I think certainly I agree that it is a major and important film, not without misgivings about it, of course, but I think it's a great film.
Thank you, Peter. But thank you for such a well-researched, interesting presentation. I learned a lot that's no about those years. To me, it's a fascinating time, and never loses fascination. But we have some time now for some questions, some comment. So do we have any comments?
Yeah.
Yes, Jill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I was, in relation to the blackface, I felt like when I was watching the film, the irony of him talking about betraying his race while he was actually wearing the blackface, and I thought, that was quite a powerful comment I felt at the time.
Yes.
The other thing I was going to comment on was just wondering, because it was such a dominant, the Jewish culture and the Jewish identity was such a dominant theme in the film, I thought that was it stood out in relation to the, other movies. And I was just wondering how that played with the general audience, because it was such a, predominantly Jewish feel to it.
No, it's a fair point. Look, because it first premiered in New York, which had already a huge Jewish population, immigrant population, there was no issue at all. But as the film rolled out, Jolson was such a popular entertainer of the day, and of course he himself was Jewish to begin with, but because he was so popular, and because the story of a family finding your own way, of mother support, eventually of getting your mother's support, etc. This whole notion of family meant that people could identify with it, even though it was a very strongly Jewish theme. So although I understand where you're coming from, for the population at the time and for the broader community across the US and eventually in Europe, it still spoke to the whole idea of finding your own way in a family without being strictured by what the expectations of your role are meant to be.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments? Peter, one of the things that I guess I get coming at this as an archivist, one of the things that fascinates me is the mechanics of how they did it. And given that you mentioned there were 15 reels, 15 discs, absolute nightmare for a projectionist. And if you bump the projector and and the needle skipped a couple of grooves, the whole thing was ruined. And this sort of would happen. But they couldn't mix sound at the time, so that each sequence, each reel, the sound had to be recorded from beginning to end in one go. And then they couldn't take it away and mix it afterwards. A couple of years later, they could. So it's possible, as I did this, to go through the film, and you can pick where the disc stops and how it starts. And in the scene where in the first song scene where he sings "Tut Tut Tutsi," now that whole scene is in a cafe, and it just sort of goes right through. He sings his song, and so on. There's applause and so on, and you can see how they had to cut the scene to match the sound recording. So at the very end, where they're applauding him, the film is repeated, is looped.
I saw that.
They kept duping the shot of the audience applauding, and they repeated about 4 or 5 times, because that's how long the sound recording went for, and they just had to match the sound recording. So it was so cleverly put together that you're not conscious of this as you're watching the film, but you can go through and you can pick those all those changes. And one also interesting comment is there's a book called The Speed of Sound about the early sound era in Hollywood. And the author noticed that when the film was re-released in 1930, they re-released it, I think, in New York, and it came off after 3 days. Nobody wanted to see it. The world had moved on so quickly. He also made other films, and and it all the whole cinema scene had shifted. Who wanted to see Gosling any longer? So show business changes so quickly. So it's it's just fascinating for the vigor of Jolson's performance, and but to me, the mechanics of how they put it together, and yeah, yes, they shifted to sound on film as soon as they could because golly, what an awful system. But at least it was the turning point of getting the sound era started. And once you had sound on film, you didn't have this problem of bumping the projector or anything else. You know, everything kept in sync all the time. Yeah.
Absolutely right, Ray. That's absolutely well observed. And yes, the technology had to be developed so rapidly because of the issues with that sound on disc, and of course the disc itself could only hold a maximum of 5 minutes anyway, and so it is quite ridiculous that. You had to keep using discs and so on. So yes, sound on film, of course, had to be progressed as rapidly as possible.
Yeah. Other comments? It does bring to mind, the question of the introduction of sound in Australia, which happened later than Hollywood. But of course, we had to do it in Australia to catch up with Hollywood, and we had to be able to show important films in Australian theatres. So we had to equip for sound, so we could show the Jazz Singer here and all the other films. But we found it difficult to do because the cost of doing it and the technology of doing it was something we had to invent locally with much smaller resources. But that's kind of a subject for another day. And but we didn't really start making our first all talking film. It's a question of definition. But our first sound feature basically was Showgirls Luck in 1931,
Right.
which started sound on disc and finished being sound on film, and that's a long story. And the film does survive, and it's in the archive, and it's a very clunky film, although absolutely fascinating when you think about how it was made. And it contains one of the actors is Arthur Townshend, who played the sentimental bloke in 1919. This is the only place where we hear his voice. We can hear what he sounded like, and he sounds exactly what he expected to sound. Yeah.
I just have a comment too. I want to ask Peter whether he thinks my reaction to the depiction of Jewish life and culture, I thought it was very authentic, and I'm not Jewish myself, but I grew up from a very early age with many Jewish friends, and to me it's given how cinema films often, particularly in the early days, often had a sort of theatrical or pseudo-theatrical characteristic. But I thought the depiction was pretty authentic. Would you comment on that? Do you think I was right, Peter, or?
Yes, I agree with you, Gwenda. I'm Jewish myself, so I'm
Yes.
obviously very sensitive to that. And it was a pretty accurate representation of Orthodox Jewish religious life, the expectations that families would have of their children, especially if they're male children, of course, in terms of following either in father's footsteps or being a doctor or lawyer or that sort of thing to integrate into society. But also this idea that family is so important and that you do not go against your family. And yes, it was very accurately represented. And Raffleson, who wrote the original play, it was part of his own lived experience and part of his own knowledge that he put into the original play in the first place. So yes, they did depict Jewish culture pretty accurately. In fact, more accurately perhaps in 1927 than in the 1952 and 1980 remakes.
Yes. That was in very. Thank you, Peter.
I've got a couple of things to observe about the, I guess, the transition to the new technology and how it was reacted to by the critics. I have two reactions. One is I remember, I think it was the director of the record label, I think it was Decca, that the Beatles were rejected from, who said something to the effect of guitar groups are going to go out of style. so we won't sign up the Beatles. But on the other hand, it's really interesting to think about how we think of the progress of technology as inevitable and as a new invention, and it will eventually or quite quickly, be taken up, like sound. It seems so obvious. But, I was thinking about 3D movie and TV technology, which hasn't taken off. It seems like a natural thing to make what you view much more real. Maybe it's just that the technology isn't good enough yet. But that obviously wasn't an issue with sound when it came into movies. So do you have any thoughts about that idea that, it seems to us now that it was inevitable that sound was going to take off very quickly, because after all, silent movies is such an artifact of the technology and doesn't represent what happens in real life. But 3D isn't progressing in the same way.
That's a good observation, and it's interesting when you look at 3D. It has had several incarnations. Then in 1953, Hollywood, 52, 53, experimented with it, and it didn't take off then. Then they tried again with the bubble, I think, in the 70s, and then they tried again more recently with animations and with a few other films. And occasionally some IMAX films are still shot in 3D. The problem is having to wear these clunky or difficult spectacles. And as soon as they develop, which they are doing with virtual reality to some extent, but eventually as soon as they develop 3D technology, which doesn't require an extra appendage that has to be worn to be able to experience 3 dimensions in that respect, then I think it will take off. But that one is proving much more difficult for filmmakers, for the industry, and for technology, because it is very difficult to replicate that sort of 3D experience that we see naturally through our eyes on a screen or on some sort of projection.
Thanks.
Yep. Other comment? Perhaps picking up from that one, yeah, we do progress with, with new technology comes out, but we also lose something on the way, which is why we can have the examples you gave, Peter, of silent films still being made, like The Artist, because with the silent film, you express certain things through the titles and through the acting. And so it was a means of communication that is not entirely displaced by sound films. It still has its own validity, which is about why we can keep watching silent films today and enjoy them as such. One doesn't entirely replace the other. Television didn't entirely replace radio. It changed it, but didn't replace it. So, and the cinema never replaced live theatre. So these things, it's just alongside each other. And I guess that's why Chaplin, persisted in wanting to make silent films into the 30s, because he felt his character expressed himself in that medium.
You could also add black and white photography to that. That black and white still has its place, even though films are mostly in colour now.
Correct. Yes. And in fact, monochrome films are still being made. So yes, and in fact, some filmmakers still experiment with silent cinema as well. More experimental films than narrative, but nevertheless, it hasn't been completely jettisoned. So yes, no, that's very fair comment, Ray.
So it just widens the scope of things that we can that we can appreciate.
Yes.
Yeah. So look,
I can go back to
yes.
to 3D for a minute. What you were saying, Peter, about the need for these clunky glasses and so on. I've got actually sitting on my fridge a couple of postcards which were sent to me by assorted jokers, which are actually in 3D, are flat, flat postcards, but they have things like crocodiles that leap out at you in a most ferocious way, and a whale, which, you know, beaches in a most ferocious way too. So, you know, that of course is just totally still. And but whether that's in any way relevant to this issue of, you know, 3D.
Well, actually, that's a good point, because 3D is still seen somewhat as a novelty
Yeah.
or a gimmick, rather than being an integrated part of a screen experience. So, yeah, it's but when they get rid of glasses and when they have proper technology one day, then we'll be able to see 3D films in 3D with our eyes that see things in 3D. I love the irony.
So are there other comments, or we're over time now?
I have one more
Yeah.
observation. Just I was really interested, Peter, when you talked about how in the film that very last scene was an adaptation that wasn't in the screenplay and wasn't in the original play. And it really seemed like that. Watching it, it seemed to be really tacked on. And it was
No, I
sort of
agree
like,
with that. I agree.
there was this whole crisis about appearing in theatre and the family and everything like that. And then this intertitle that says, a few years later, everything was okay, you know. And I thought that was very disappointing in terms of filmmaking and narrative.
Yes, but you have to understand, in 1927, Warner Brothers, they wanted an upbeat sort of ending. They wanted something positive so people can leave the cinema whistling or singing Al Jolson songs.
I totally understand that, and
Yes.
and the song is at the end. But you'd think they could have spent like 1 minute to make the transition a little bit more realistic. But anyway, that's
I agree.
It was clunky.
Yes, I fully agree. But nevertheless, it spoke to the audience, so they knew what they were doing at the time, what they wanted at the time, and it certainly worked.
It's hard to believe it's nearly 100 years ago too.
Yes,
it's like
almost
1927's 100 years ago. My God.
Yes.
Close.
Yes, I remember it well.
Yes, to tell you about copyright.
Yes, the whole issue of copyright. That's right. So all films in 1924 are now out of copyright, I think, or is it 95 years or 100 years? I'm not sure.
It's 100 years, no, 28. So Steamboat Willie is out of copyright now.
That's right. Yes.
It's 95 years. Sorry, it's 95 years in American copyright law, which is a very strange law, but it's 95 years.
That's it.
Different in other countries, but so that's why Steamboat Willie's out of copyright.
Yes.
Certainly the jazz singer out of copyright.
Yes.
Isn't that only if there's no surviving family or something?
Look, this is well, American copyright law is based on registering your book or your film or whatever with the Library of Congress. You have to actually do it. Then you have to renew it. 28 years, 14, whatever it is. There's a sequence. And if you forget to renew it, it passes into public domain.
Yeah.
Okay. In Australia, our law is quite different. In most other countries, law is quite different. Copyright exists as soon as it's made, and it exists. Okay, in Australia, all films made before 1955 are out of copyright as films, but the screenplay could still be in copyright, or music could still be in copyright, or whatever. So there can be residual copyrights that do apply. So it's not a simple thing. Our copyright law is messy. So if you've got a film from 1955, you think, okay, it's out of copyright. But if the screenplay still belongs to somebody who's still alive, then okay, they have a claim to it.
So Jet is out of copyright.
Yeah, so it's messy. It's messy.
UK law's different. I think it's 70 years after the death of the last of the producer, director, writer, and score composer. So Rescue by Rover from 1905, I think, is still in copyright because Cecil Hepworth died in the 50s.
Oh dear, okay. Okay, because I think I'm not sure how many copyright acts there are, but I think it is complicated. I think there've been attempts recently to try and simplify it, but really it's still somewhat messy. And so this question arises with the recent discovery of Captain Thunderbolt, where the complete version of a 1951 film that was released in 53. Anyway, it is now out of copyright. At least the film is. Whether there are any residual claims is still up in the air. So, yeah. So there we go. So one always has to be careful about these things, and in case you get, you infringe somebody's copyright unintentionally. But of course, copyright began back in the Elizabethan age to protect the rights of the author for their lifetime. I think for a fairly short period of time, and it's kind of exploded into something that's a bit of a monster now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, look, we're over time, so I'll bring it to a close. Thank you, Peter, for such a thoroughly researched presentation and a fascinating background story to the film. So thank you all for joining in this afternoon, and thank you again, Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Ray.
Ich habe den ganzen Müll auf meinem Computer.